The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody, welcome to Cross Lake's next webinar here. We're going to get started in about 3 minutes, so just hold tight. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're at the start time for the webinar. We're just going to wait 1 more minute and just dive in. So just be a second. Welcome everybody to Cross Lake's next in our series of webinars. This one on modernizing legacy architecture, where we're going to talk about the whys, the whats, a little bit of the hows on this tough and challenging business problem for many companies out there that have some legacy software as part of their history and that need to address that for various reasons, of which our speaker Wayne is going to get into here in just a minute. First, a couple of housekeeping things. The slides for the webinar are available in your handouts window. You should be able to download those directly. We will also, after the webinar, follow up with some direct links to the slides, as well as a recording that we will have available sometime within about 24 hours after the webinar. If you have questions today, I encourage you to ask those through the questions window in your GoToWebinar little client there. Otherwise, you can also try raising your hand, and we'll save a little bit more of the verbal questions until the end of the presentations. But if you have questions that are real time in the middle, please ask those in the questions window, and we'll make sure to get those addressed as close to real time as possible. And all questions are fair game, so we strongly encourage you to keep this interactive. Now on to our speaker. As I mentioned, our topic today is modernizing legacy architecture. Our speaker is Wayne Filin-Matthews. He has done work with Cross Lake for a number of years now. He's formerly the global head of digital architecture for HSBC, and he has spent a lot of his career dealing with software architecture, both on the software side of things and the infrastructure side of things, and has a wealth of knowledge and lots of stories to tell on some of his experiences. So without further ado, Wayne, I'll turn it over to you and we'll get started.
Thank you, James. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as James said. Welcome to Cross Lake's Modernizing Legacy Architecture webinar. A couple of things before we get started in terms of just a little bit more in terms of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at drivers for modernizing, some of the business and technology views, some of the complexities, and specifically around the value of modernizing legacy application and infrastructure architecture. We're going to look a little bit from a business perspective, but also from the technology lens point of view. I've been in the industry, as James mentioned, about 30 years now, and this particular topic is interesting in terms of organizations on both how they approach it, but also some of those more broader considerations that are often overlooked when trying to strategize what a modernization approach should be for an organization. We're also going to look at some of the technology considerations as well as best and current proven practices, just some of the approaches and mindset that an organization when looking at legacy modernization, some of the pitfalls and some of those considerations that are often overlooked that sit outside both the technology and business lens perspective. For each topic, we'll just look at reviewing some of the questions that James is kindly moderating for us. We'll look at some of the red flags and some of the sort of good signs in terms of best and current proven practice around some of the things that we're going to call out. We are going to keep things high level. We're not going to go into some of the depth considerations, but it's more around the mindset of architecture and some of those areas that are often overlooked from an architectural perspective. And hopefully you'll ask some questions as we go along to keep it interactive and to keep me on my toes so I'm not just presenting to you as well. A little bit about Crosslake. If you're not familiar with Crosslake, we're sort of North American and European offices, but we sort of really do work globally in regards to helping customers achieve their sort of short-term and long-term strategic aims when it comes to their investments in software specifically. So obviously from a customer perspective, we're trying to drive the maximum benefit and outcomes to those customers, but also obviously address the considerations from a business lens as well. So broad and deep and covering a lot of work across the globe in terms of the customer base that we serve today. So before we get into some of those considerations that I mentioned, one of the things that I wanted to do on this particular webinar was look at the drivers and value for modernization. Sometimes it's overlooked when we consider the technology first perspective, when an organization is technology led and not business led or customer led, and that drives some overarching considerations that sometimes are overlooked, which causes a lot of organizations to miss some key considerations when approaching the concerns of why they should modernize in the first instance. So why modernize legacy applications at all? The first thing that I wanted to note was just really what is a legacy application. And again, it's really when you're looking at the sort of global perspective, there's a lot of confusion and a lot of misinterpretation, both on the approach, but also what should be sometimes just improvements in current engineering practices that can often be overlooked when people talk around modernization based on the latest buzzwords or the latest trends from a technology lens. But a legacy application, just to set the scene before we get into some of the other slides, is really any business application that is based on older technologies, but yet continue to support, and the key word here is core business functions. We're going to see as we go through the webinar that just because something is legacy or outdated doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be modernized based on that core business function and why it should actually be looked at in terms of value and fit. These systems tend to be monolithic, meaning that they've been designed with little or no modularity. They're not really portable, so they don't take advantage of the agility and elasticity that some modern technology platforms give to us, and really have sort of little or reusable code snippets, so not modularized in terms of the actual application or the infrastructure that the application sits upon. And most organization, based on our interactions with customers and my experience over the 30 years, I was at Microsoft for 10 years and as James mentioned, as the head of global architecture for HSBC for the last number of years, helping them to sort of look at architecture from their digital transformation perspective. And a lot of organizations, sort of really need that help in terms of strategic guidance to determine when and where architectural, and I highlight the key word here, managed innovation is appropriate. A lot of organizations tend to approach modernization of legacy application based on all the qualities that they're going to get from modernization, but actually lack both that sort of consideration around industrialization of a modernized technology stack versus what they want to do when it comes to manage innovation and experimentation. So we're going to touch upon these things as we go through the webinar in terms of just our observations, just to throw in a couple of things in terms of what I've seen just from a personal perspective over the last 30 years, and just provide some general consistency of language when it comes to modernizing legacy applications. The key really to deciding when to modernize is really those decisions on when it's justifiable to re-architect, when we're looking at rehosting applications, when we need to rebuild an application, or refactor or replace existing systems. Again, some terminology consistency here. When you look at the white papers and a lot of research that's out there in terms of documented approaches to modernizing legacy application, there's a lot of inconsistency in regards to how these things are mentioned and discussed. So hopefully I can pull those things together, so at least by the end of the webinar that we're all consistent, at least on this call, in regards to some of those considerations when it comes to language around modernization factors. The one real key thing to pull out is there really is no silver bullet when we look at architecture modernization or modernizing legacy software architecture. It's up to technology leaders, both from a business perspective and from the technology side of the business. When it comes to looking at how to modernize technologies, applications need to first to be evaluated, and the legacy systems need to be evaluated, not only from a technology lens or an IT lens, but more importantly from a business lens perspective. And what are the drivers that are driving the modernization efforts within an organization? Choosing the right approach with the highest value and the highest effect and lowest risk, and really just considering the cost elements are some of the paramount decisions that an organization has to take. Again, often overlooked when sort of organizations are full steam ahead in a digital transformation, that close tie-in to the strategic business objectives can sometimes get lost when we look at the low-level technology modernization considerations. And I'll hopefully give you some examples where I've seen that previously as we get onto the topic areas within the webinar moving forward. So what's the cost and risk of not modernizing? According to industry research such as Vanson Bourne and Forrester and various others, 90% of IT professionals say legacy architecture and legacy application architecture are preventing them from taking advantage of digital technologies that will help them become more efficient. We see that more than 90% of consumers said that they would consider taking their business elsewhere rather than working with the companies that use outdated technologies. So I'll pause there for a moment in terms of the priority elements that I called out on this particular research. You could basically say that the IT professionals, in terms of wanting to work on modernization, we're currently in this sort of vacuum at the minute, and you may see this yourselves in regards to the difficulty to find key skill sets and capabilities, specifically where technology skills and capabilities are fairly thinly stretched across organizations. I recently was in India speaking to a lot of external vendors from a resourcing perspective, and normally doing work in India, the ability to get good engineering and good architecture from my personal perspective has been quite easy over the last sort of 10 or 15 years. But we're sort of at this pinch point now where where it's actually becoming more and more difficult based on the speed of technology change and the skill set that's required to support that technology change to actually find the right people with a level and breadth of skill that really can help an organization modernize. I also see organizations, and we see this in Cross Lake, that are having to hire sort of, I'll give an example, sort of C# developers and retrain them in Java if that's their platform of choice. So we start to see this cross-fertilization of skill sets and capabilities, which sort of supports the research that Vance and Bourne and Forrester have highlighted, with IT professionals saying legacy architecture is preventing them from taking advantage of digital technologies. I would also say that obviously from a consumer perspective, that that's fairly significant in terms of customers wanting to take their business elsewhere, just because of lack of digital support that some of the modernized technologies give to them from a customer perspective. According to the IDC, by the end of 2018, 73% of Global 2000 enterprises will have digital transformation at the center of their business strategy. And, we often get caught up in terms of the term digital. I mean, we work in computing, we have to work in a digital era. But actually having a digital transformation perspective that really appeases both the business need but also the customer need is significantly higher. And if you don't have that digital transformation consideration at the heart of what an organization's doing, then really you're potentially being left behind already. Outdated legacy systems can make for poor cross-team coordination and major data inconsistencies. So again, whilst this is based on spreadsheets and applications, you can see that 88% of applications today, including spreadsheets, basically will contain errors. And when we look at latest trends such as DevOps, and we look at DevSecOps, and we look at the ability to leverage cloud qualities in terms of those two things together, really the aim that we're trying to do is increase velocity, increase agility, but ultimately from an automation perspective, decrease that human intervention and some of the sort of poor quality that the research has highlighted in terms of some of the cross-team coordination and major data inconsistencies that often are found in organizations, specifically when we go in to do due diligence type work, where we're looking at software application at a low level, but also those architectural considerations at a broad level as well. A few drivers for modernization that often come up both from the business and shareholder or customer priority perspective versus the technology priorities that we often see. Increasing enterprise growth and customer demand, attracting and retaining new customers, reducing enterprise cost, creating new products and services, so managed innovation, improving business processes and implementing updating business applications. And I won't read through the whole list there, but as you can see, there's a number of business and customer and shareholder priorities that are sort of key drivers for modernization. And then when we pair that with the technology priorities on the opposite side of the coin, we can see that cloud and microservices, virtualization, containerization, mobile technologies, improvements in IT management and governance, some of the business intelligence, including artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the remainder of that list. When you sort of pair those two things together, what you find is there's sort of the key modernization considerations that tend to come into play for most organizations, and actually how to approach those when things are changing so quickly becomes both a strategic need for an organization, but also can add that level of complexity in terms of deciding what to prioritize when it comes to looking at a particular application set, or whether to look at a capability and how to modernize that capability specifically to take advantage of the things that the research within the industry highlights in terms of giving customers more opportunity to appease their desires and needs, but also at the same time making sure that the business is driving the sort of innovation and the outcomes that they're expecting in terms of business and shareholder value. So these were just some of the considerations that we see, and you could probably write a few more pages in regards to the drivers for modernization specifically, which again, sort of for me personally is obviously what adds to the complexity in deciding how to approach a sort of digital transformation modernization approach within an organization today. SED is a method in terms of just looking at architecture and engineering. Some of you may have come across this. But some of the things that we see within Crosslake and some of the things that we've captured that have become repeatable in terms of really highlighting those patterns where an organization has some common deficiencies. The first one is structure in terms of understanding the current landscape and considerations, both from a fitness perspective, value and agility of that current landscape. So that end-to-end view, specifically where mergers and acquisitions are taking place, or maybe that they're just really on that digital transformation journey right from the start. Once the structure is understood, one of the deficiencies that we often see is really alignment to meeting the business and customer demand. Organizations that are technology-led will often drive conversations around the best design or the best engineering practices for the right architecture. But obviously, if that doesn't map back to the current landscape that considers fitness, value, and agility, then there can often be a misalignment specifically. The third one is around integrity. So does the architecture meet the business needs for both compliance, regulatory, and security concerns? A lot of organizations, when they're looking at digital transformation journeys, they're still managing some of the sort of control areas that are needed, that need to ensure that as they go through the transformational journey, that they're sort of set up for success right from the beginning, that allows them to leverage the benefits that they've invested, that allows them to exploit the technology investments that both they've already made, but also to ensure that they don't incur the technical debt or unmanaged technical debt that causes them concerns when they're actually modernizing their internal architectures. And then finally, what we often see are really an organization that hasn't determined the sort of best and current proven engineering practices before they start the transformation journey. So we see a lot of organizations that have started the journey. They're leveraging the benefits of cloud. They've started the DevOps journey. That they've highlighted some of the considerations early on, but they end up with still poor engineering practices, which ultimately they may not see in the first 1-2 years of the digital transformation program, but they potentially will incur the technical debt where they're going to have to go back and try to remediate tactical choices that they've made based on proven or lack of current proven engineering practices that have sort of naturally transitioned into the target state architectural considerations as they go through the architectural life cycle. So these were just some of the common deficiencies that really needed to be called out, in parallel to obviously looking at the strategic roadmap for architecture within an organization to make sure that the current landscape or the snapshot of time of that current landscape is well understood and well documented, and really a good understanding of technical debt is well understood before they start, or at least is being addressed as they take the digital transformation journey within that organization itself. So that gives you some of the background in terms of what we see that are the key drivers for modernization with a lot of organization. The what from a business lens perspective, there's a lot of modernization complexities. If we look at application architecture and some of the engineering practices and the technical decision making that needs to be done at the application architecture level, when we look at infrastructure architecture and topics such as containerization and portability and the ability to leverage the quality considerations of a modern architecture, We look at digital business innovation and sort of the parallel activities from a cultural perspective where organizations are driving the DevOps or DevSecOps culture within an organization. And what I've noticed in sort of the last couple of roles, that actually having clarity in terms of how some of these areas, including modern engineering techniques and some of the more modern approaches to architecture, there has to be a really strong leadership team in place to manage the complexities between all of these cogs in the wheel that really make the decision making challenging for a lot of organizations that we come across. It's either very much focused on application architecture or very much focused on infrastructure architecture, or we'll have, you know, some of the latest greatest that have learned the new modernization technology stack, and it becomes driven from a technology lens perspective only. And we see this continuously in organizations where they struggle sometimes to basically to look at this holistically and pull those cogs so they're actually working together to appease the desires of their customers and ultimately drive the business need. When we look at the business and technology views from an external and internal perspective within an organization as well, one of the key things that we're looking for is, as I've mentioned in the structure and alignment perspective in the previous slide, is fitness in regards to the current architecture, the value of the architectural current state, but also the value that they wish to see from the target state architecture, and that ability or agility to move things at pace with, you know, things such as continuous integration and continuous development from a CI/CD perspective. The pace of change within an organization is extremely high, and you've probably experienced that yourselves in the organizations that you're aligned to. And obviously tying those into the consideration and prioritization of what should be modernized becomes one of those key factors. Some external examples that drive this, such as digital business support, the ever-changing requirements, when we look at sort of modern practices around safe and disciplined agile development, where we're sort of managing a backlog on a sometimes a daily basis, sometimes multiple releases per day. These all become sort of external factors that add pressure to the technology teams when they're thinking about not only the prioritization, but also that mindset of feature release and customer first feature release in terms of what value that customers are going to get by that feature release on a regular change. Regulatory and compliance, I spent the last couple of years, like I say, in HSBC, where a lot of my time was spent around regulatory and compliance consideration. So how do you adopt and move an organization as big as and complex as HSBC, but also at the same time, which is often overlooked in the conversations around velocity and safety together. So how do you ensure that you consider driving those things in parallel? And also the skills shortage, which becomes an external factor, as I mentioned previously. Internal considerations, cost, complexity, risk, and just some examples there in terms of managing technical debt, change in skills demand, etc., etc. So these are the things that, from an external, internal perspective, that ultimately we're sort of prioritizing to get the most value out of the architectural and modernization efforts that we're trying to do within organizations today. Some of the business KPI.
Wait, just wanted to jump in here with a question. There was an interesting question that came in. How do you think about improving architecture versus modernization? We're talking a lot here about modernizing, but is an improvement initiative kind of the same thing, or how do you distinguish?
From an engineering perspective and architecture perspective, I think for me is when I look at engineering practices, then they tend to be the sort of, when I look at things such as SAFe and I look at a 12-week look ahead versus a sort of 6-month or 3 to 6 month look ahead, Very much of the conversation is around engineering best and current proven practice. Architecture, and this concept is becoming more and more considered in the industry, which is how do you ensure that you have a minimal viable architecture, an MVA, that supports the minimal viable product in terms of that strategic element, so the short term, but also really that you have a target state architecture from a modernization perspective that gives you the runway beyond the sort of 12 weeks or the 6 months, that gives you a sort of 12 to 18 month view. And what tends to be lacking today in most of the DevOps cultures that I come across is the DevOps culture is basically really good at understanding how to do minimum viable product, but that terminology of minimum viable architecture, which is the just-in-time architecture to support the MVP, but actually what is that long-term runway to make sure that the organizations don't incur technical debt. So you have to really have a strong sort of architectural presence within the DevOps team to actually support the long runway, but at the same time ensuring that the MVP is still being met in the short-term 12-week look ahead, if that makes sense.
Great. So think longer term, but still have that minimum viable architecture in place and have the practices to back that up.
Absolutely. And it does take a mind shift. It's a great question because it does take a mindset shift where architects, specifically solution architects, are sort of in the weeds, doing, working with the sort of product managers and technical program managers in a DevOps team today. That really basically it takes a mindset shift to actually think about the strategic runway within their particular product group to ensure that that's being considered more broadly. A couple of other indicators for modernization in terms of the need as well, customer bad attrition, and I'm not going to read these off to you. They're really just the considerations that we see, some of those sort of areas that are really sort of the key indicators. One of the primary ones for me that I often see is an organizational's runtime costs. So for the last few organizations, and a lot of organizations that we deal with in Crosslake, one of the key indicators that digital transformation and modernization efforts are succeeding is when the maintenance spend or the runtime spend to keep the lights on for the organization is decreasing, and that budget allocation is then moved over to the managed spend. Today, I would say, and again, this is just based on my own observations, is I'd still say 80% of organizations are quite high that have embraced things such as DevOps and cloud, still see an increase in those runtime costs because they don't have a process, a method, some systematic approaches to actually approach modernization. So for me, that's one of the key indicators that an organization is being successful in terms of determining on whether their modernization efforts are paying off or whether some fine tuning is required, really to actually consider that as they approach modernization efforts. Some of the technology KPIs, obviously, if support costs are increasing, if there's a significant increase in code vulnerabilities, if unmanaged technical debt, and again, I could prioritize these in a number of ways depending on the organizations that we're working with. But unmanaged technical debt is either just logged or just captured with no sort of, again, systematic approach to repay that technical debt, such as, and it ties back to the question that was just asked, which was, an architectural function within a modern DevSecOps team that is only concentrating on minimal viable product is probably going to incur some significant technical debt because they'll be doing a lot more tactical solutions while some of the strategic modernization efforts are sort of happening in the background, maybe via different teams or some of the broader capabilities that are needed to support those teams. So again, these are just indicators to say, if you're seeing these in the organization, any one of these things, then it's probably an indicator that either modernization needs to take place, or if you're sort of well down the journey already in terms of digital transformation, these are the things that tend to mean that there's some focus needed in some specific areas to fine-tune that, and modernization and just on its own won't address those problems. So just some considerations from a technology lens perspective. There's a number of options that we can approach. We can obviously leave as is, and this is based on some common terminology. I try to be consistent in regards to some of the things that you'll hear out there in the industry today. But sometimes an option is to leave as is. That it's lower risk, but the cost or loss of competitive advantage can be high. When we look at gradual replace, again, lower risk, but again, competitive advantage may be high. Organizations specifically that I see in the financial services industry and the competitive threat with fintech, that need to do things at a much faster pace is really driven by the market demand and some of the innovation that takes place in the market today. Option 3, migrate or rehost. Again, medium risk, not necessarily a bad thing. And extend or re-architect. So this is where you're looking at sort of significant investment up front, and then looking at building out that architecture and moving at pace to that re-architecture. And a lot of the industry analysis sort of says, oh, pick an option and follow that option. But to be honest with you, within Crosslake and just based on my own experience, you normally are doing sort of 1, 2 of these approaches, or maybe even all of them. There's never a single approach to actually modernization efforts. It's normally a mixture based on the prioritization of the modernization consideration that you're looking at, that you may take different approaches to modernize that application and infrastructure architecture, and careful management of that. A classic example is when we see customers migrating to cloud. Often they overlook the considerations of, well, what happens to the data center if you haven't planned the capabilities to move to cloud in the appropriate sequence? Well, you end up with a data center that potentially looks like Swiss cheese, which is, you've got racks with hubs and routers and servers in that are still supporting the sort of capabilities and applications that are still under that modernization consideration. So again, pulling these together, really wanted just to call out there isn't a single option. You're probably approaching different things based on the prioritization and migration plan for the technology and business needs that are required. This next couple of slides are just a couple of scenarios. I'm not going to read to you the elements that are on here, but one of the common scenarios we see is potentially things such as business logic in the client layer. Sometimes this is based on just poor engineering practices. Sometimes it's just overlooked. Sometimes it's just old, and some of these were created before some of the common patterns, such as MVC as an example, were sort of well known and used. The key reason to include these scenarios in today's webinar is just to really reinforce that the initial effort has to be business led in terms of the prioritization of the capabilities that's going to give the most value, but also really understanding, even when you look at an application, without looking at the application and doing the assessment of that application to understand its current structure and sort of the requirements of the structure that should be driven by the business outcome, you really have sort of these red flags coming up that it's not technology first. There's a sort of tiering of consideration as you go through each one. Obviously, business logic in the client code makes it difficult for a business to make that application portable, ultimately then driving some complexity and some of the agility that's needed from a tightly coupled architecture when we have business logic in client code. Common one that we see is tightly coupled 2-tier application architectures. Again, a consideration that a lot of organizations will still have today. Makes it difficult, again, for the same reasons. A tightly coupled 2-tier application architecture makes it difficult to support. It makes it difficult from a portability perspective, hence making it more complex to actually add new features from a velocity perspective to appease the customer needs based on that increased velocity. Again, a couple of things here in terms of just really dated technology modernization. So older technology. Again, these considerations from a red flag perspective here normally are around things such as license, vulnerabilities, non-supported code. And this also follows through in terms of even the considerations of modernization architecture. I'll give you an example. If you don't, for example, have a version strategy, it could be N-1, which means you want to keep your technology and application and infrastructure and network to a particular version. You may run into troubles such as, I'll give you an example that I often see, that a lot of organizations have a minimum regulatory requirement for the network layer to be at a certain level. The problem with that often means that you have to support older, Android devices, iPhone devices. Even that level of complexity with data technology modernization comes back to that consideration from a business perspective and regulatory and compliance, that we're trying to tie those considerations together to ensure not only that the organization can be portable and flexible and agility and secure, but also basically provides them a way to ensure that modernization doesn't become a migration effort later on. It should really be that mindset that says modernization should be an ongoing consideration, and we should make modernization as simple and seamless as possible for an organization moving forward.
Hey, Wayne, another quick question. Well, maybe not so quick, but the move to the cloud, we're talking about that a lot with our modernization topics here. Is a move to the cloud basically mandatory these days, and to consider that at least when we're considering modernization? What's your take on that?
Great, another great question. I'm glad that these questions are coming in fast and thick today. So my observation, again, not only from working at Microsoft for 10 years, but a lot of work on sort of AWS and Google Compute platforms, is that a lot of organizations will dip their toe into two things, and they do it either in parallel, which is the best approach, or they'll do it in isolation. So let me explain what I mean. Is we see a lot of organizations that are sort of moving to digital DevSecOps as an example. So they're fully invested, and they're sort of fully invested in that DevOps journey. The reality is, though, that if you're not leveraging the benefits of cloud, then actually DevOps without cloud doesn't give you that elasticity, agility that for the first time, where Moore's law has been broken, that gives us that ability to take DevOps as a method, as a cultural element, as a framework, and to do application development. Without cloud, then you end up sort of in a stagnant place where you don't really see the benefit, and you end up with these higher run costs and higher technical debt. And then we have on the other flip side of the coin, those that are fully invested in cloud, and they're sort of full steam ahead with their cloud journeys, but they're only sort of dipping their toe into sort of some of the DevOps considerations. So to answer the question is, you have to think about them both. You can't really get the agility scale or the quality uplifts that you would expect from modernization efforts, to be honest with you, without leveraging the benefits of cloud. And again, we should sort of quash the mindset consideration that cloud is not just private, public, or hybrid. Cloud is a design principle that, from an architectural perspective, whether you're creating a private cloud on premise due to regulatory concern, or whether you're leveraging public cloud vendors such as AWS or Google Compute or Microsoft Azure, it's more around how you're approaching the consideration for designing your architectures to give you the sort of qualities that you would expect to address all the business KPIs and the technology KPIs that we highlighted earlier on. So to answer, yes, but just not in isolation, without DevSecOps sitting in the background and running in parallel.
Got it. Thank you.
So again, scenario 4 is a common one that we see in terms of replacing the monolithic application. Tends to be mainframe, so difficult to make changes, team autonomy is separated. I've been doing this for 30 years, and I can remember my first gig working for Barclays Investment Banking, where there was a project to demise the mainframe, and fast forward 30 years, and the same conversations are taking place in terms of plans to demise the mainframe. The problem with these monolithic applications and considerations is they become complicated, and a lot of the business core functionality and business process sits within them. But actually, a lot of the time, the approach to demise, and we see this with this I'm going to talk about quickly in a moment, which is the API economy, is those modernization efforts where we're putting that middle tier layer in to modularize some of the considerations and migrations away from the monolith, are actually now for the first time doable. It just takes significant investment and also basically considerable planning to look at what that demise plan should be. So this sort of moves us on to the API economy consideration. A lot of organizations have invested or are about to invest in API-led architectural and modernization efforts, and some have been doing it for a couple of years. Some organizations are just on that journey. What I wanted to call out here is a lot of organizations will consider each one of these things in isolation. So they'll go full steam ahead because they want to reduce traffic to the mainframe. So they'll go away and they'll write good APIs, and that they'll connect to the systems as back-end services. At the same time, they're obviously leveraging the API economy, coming back to the point that I made earlier, which is ensuring that the modernization efforts are not time-bound to a sort of big modernization effort moving forward, but also they set themselves up for success in regards to ensuring that they have APIs to connecting to their core systems moving forward as well. We have experience APIs in terms of the app dev, so purpose-built APIs for apps, and those two tend to be the first things that an organization will look at. But what they often then forget is the process API layer. So again, I see this in a lot of large enterprise organizations where the process API layer becomes an afterthought, but yet it's one of the most complicated areas, not only from a technology sort of process perspective in its own right, but also ownership and accountability. Who should own the process API? Is it the back end system? Is it the core record owner that owns the process API? Or is it the DevSecOps team themselves that are actually writing and creating those? And again, I think a lot of organizations are still going through that journey. There aren't many best and co-proven practices that are out there, just because a lot of organizations haven't gone through that full life cycle. So again, I wanted to share this specifically, that an API-led modernization effort is definitely required, but some of the granularity consideration where Crosslake has, just due to the breadth that we have within Crosslake and the experience that we've had with these organizations, is really that careful consideration from an API-led perspective in terms of what's needed and what needs to be considered to ensure that you're setting yourself up for future success. So we've talked a little bit about the what and some of those considerations around the business and technology lens, and just some of the observations that we see in terms of modernization effort. In terms of some of the proven modernization effort and approaches that we see, again, careful consideration of value and fit. So we'll go into an organization, and our first conversation is the expected outcomes, and do that level setting in terms of what are the expected outcomes, not only from a business perspective, but also really get to understand human-centric design considerations, where ultimately customer first at the center of what we do in technology, from a business perspective, are really well understood, both by us and the business themselves in terms of who we're working with. We also want to understand cost and complexity in terms of the prioritization efforts, to ensure that the priority of modernization effort is both well understood from a risk perspective, but also from ours, and that sort of ties us into both risks and residual risk across the application focus and the infrastructure focus are well understood as well. And then ultimately, what are the expected agility and velocity with safety gains that an organization is expecting to see? So these are sort of the core pillars that when we're approaching the modernization effort, we want to understand, early on in the engagement. And from that, then we'll sort of approach the modernization considerations based on any one of those options, or a sort of mixture of those options that we mentioned previously in terms of it. Modernization effort, Crosslake has a multitude of intellectual property that we've built up over the years, specifically on approaching modernization effort. So that really sort of RAG status that takes in fit and agility and repayment of technical debt and all the things that we've talked about on this morning's call, to really give customers a comfortable feeling that when they're approaching some of these things, that there's some systematic method sitting behind it. It's not just technologists basically driving the conversation. So we have a number of systematic approaches in terms of all the things that we've talked about, and really I think that's where I see the value working at Crosslake comes in for a lot of organizations is really it's that fail fast learn quickly approach, where we've built up that, where a lot of organizations don't have it. They have spot people that have done this previously, but no systematic approach that really sort of looks at all of the considerations for modernization efforts within an organization today. Again, this just ties back into some of the how, in terms of really focusing on the pre-work, and the considerations around the pre-work effort should not be underestimated. It's not about just talking about cloud and microservices and containerization and the orchestration of portability of a containerized architecture. It's really sort of having that method to say, understanding the architectural baseline if it's not well understood, how to move an organization to an automated pipeline where the human interaction becomes reduced, obviously reducing risk based on what we see a lot of organizations may not even know that they have today. How do we take monolithic applications and modularize them in a way that allows an organization to leverage the qualities of modern approaches to architecture, and all the way through to automated sort of code and deployment methodologies? And I could spend probably a whole other week talking about this one slide specifically, but if you're interested, obviously you can reach out to us for further information, and we'll be doing a number of webinars post this in regards to some of these specific areas as well. In terms of conversation guidance for some of this stuff, these were just some of the things that we capture and highlight as part of our engagements with the customers that we work. Is you'll pick up on sort of those signals and patterns from customers and organizations of all sizes and all levels in regards to approaching this, and every organization, to be honest with you, is approaching it in a slightly different way, which adds to some of the complexity in terms of consolidating best and current proven practice to address this. But these are the key things for me are principles first, making sure there's a primacy of principles consideration. If they're talking about patterns, we often see sort of sometimes a half-hearted effort from a pattern applicability, such as not leveraging things such as a common pattern like the Strangler pattern in terms to do incremental modernization around those considerations. And then just talking about the business viewpoint, you sort of hear those organizations that are struggling, everything from the ability to create and understand actionable insights from the data that they have, to the ever increasing costs in regards to supporting an infrastructure, through to not having the right people involved from a skill set or capabilities perspective to sort of really get them going to leverage the velocity and safety considerations that modernization should be giving to a lot of organizations, but isn't doing it at the speed that the industry is probably driving today. Some of the modernization principles that we apply within Crosslake and are industry best and current proven practice. So configuration before customization, we still see lack of maturity in around effective decision making around when to customize before when to get commercial off the shelf, or even the business or customer demand around configuration before customization. There should be principles of portability and replaceability, and we used to talk a lot about reusability. And whilst it's still important in the architectural runway, we also basically have to consider how to design something that when it fails, that it becomes replaceable almost immediately. And again, it comes back to the question around cloud. You only can really leverage some of the elements of replaceability, which ultimately drive a significant quality uplift for an organization. So again, should be factored into some of those good best and current proven design principle considerations, both for application and infrastructure architecture. Infrastructure as a code is another one, so making sure that the immutable considerations around infrastructure and what is deemed in the industry as the snowflake effect around infrastructure should also be considered as a core principle. And again, I'm not going to list these. Again, we can talk about this for probably a half a day in terms of what are the best and current architectural principles that should be followed. But each one of these should be in place as an organization starts the journey, or if they're not in place, to make sure that when you're doing digital design authority reviews, that they can be considered, and then ensuring that the architecture is being created and meeting these principles. The final thing is, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, is we really want to be pattern-based. Just from a repeatability perspective, a lot of organizations still struggle. And again, this is a tried and tested, proven way of approaching modernization effort, where pattern-based modernization, which is really gives us that sort of reusability. A lot of organizations today are still inventing the wheel. And whilst we're all on this journey together, specifically, which we're only going to see increase, is really the approach that we take within Crosslake is not obviously only principles first, but also to ensure that we're following some of the common modernization patterns and equally important anti-patterns in terms of when not to do something, that removes some of that ambiguity in decision making, and ensures that the principles that we've defined are enduring, which ultimately de-risks those conflicting decisions that we often see within an organization, both from a political perspective, a technology perspective, and a business lens perspective as well. So that's really it for the content. Like I say, it's a high-level overview in terms of what we see at Crosslake. It's a high-level overview in terms of just some of my personal experience working for some of these organizations. Hopefully you found it useful. I'll pause there now, just with the sort of six or 7 minutes we have left to answer any more specific questions that may come up.
Thanks, Wayne. So as you have been doing, keep the questions coming through the chat window, or we can unmute you if necessary. While we wait on that, just a couple of housekeeping tips here. So the recording for this webinar will be available, will be sent to all attendees in about 24 hours. Give us a couple days maximum to send that out to you. I also want to point out the Crosslake blog, and I'll put that in the chat window in just a second. It's got a lot of what Wayne's talking about, as well as other legacy and other technology topics in there. Lots of good reading. Also, I wanted to point out our upcoming webinars. No dates confirmed yet, but we have one on implementing DevOps and automation, which will back up a lot of the things Wayne has been talking about here for the last hour. It's one of those mandatory things in a modernization effort to make sure you're successful. Also, another one also plays into some things that Wayne mentioned earlier about the challenges in finding outsourced developers in India and other places. We're going to talk about some of the how-tos of outsourcing and distributed development. So stay tuned for announcements on those ones as well. Wayne, we do have another question in the hopper here. What are the top reasons why modernization projects stall or fail?
That's it. That's another great question. These are great questions, by the way. There's a couple of reasons for me. One is that, again, is skill set. even I'll give an example in terms of a large organization that I was working with recently is, that they've invested a significant amount in regards to the investment, but yet still runtime costs are going up. And some of it is really just the speed at which they're moving. So the number one reason is the speed, is really, if you haven't had a systematic approach that considers everything from, cultural structure, and the cultural behavior of modernization effort. So that's one area, all the way through to sort of the layers of control in an automated way to speed up the CI/CD pipeline, through to just the considerations of method and systematic approaches to managing technical debt. Is a lot of individuals and a lot of organizations are still either culturally still doing things that are sort of 10 years old in terms of the approach. I was in an organization over the last couple of weeks where, they don't even have a good set of principles that they follow, which means that they're still very much in that place where they're sort of making decisions on the fly. So culture is one in terms of the modernization effort, and just underestimating what's actually needed end to end. The second one is really just an organization that is not really fully prepared to take the approach in terms of, just because it's political challenges and not technical or business challenges. I'll give you an example. If you're going to speak to a large organization that's invested heavily in infrastructure, then potentially the infrastructure team is going to be a little bit wary around consuming cloud. They should see it as an opportunity to learn new skills. But if they've been with an organization for a long time, then obviously learning new skills for a lot of organizations and a lot of people involved become a challenge as well. So it's a mixture of bringing the skill set and capability up that basically captures all the things that we've talked about on this call. And then there's organizational politics in terms of ownership of current modernization, sort of legacy applications, and maybe they don't have that skill set, so you then have to go externally. And sometimes that's difficult to do because obviously they have a lot of experience in terms of how the legacy applications work. So those are the two of the top two. It's nothing to do with the technology, to be honest with you. The technology is well understood. It tends to be really cultural is the first, and organizational politics, and some of that is in relation to not following best and current proven practices around pattern driven, principle driven sort of technology decision making that is simplified in an automated way. I would say that I'll be honest with you, they're the top ones, and sometimes they're just overlooked, and sort of it's the technology is leading the conversation, but it needs to be balanced between them. It needs to be good architecture balanced with good technology decision making, and then ultimately organizations tend to succeed.
Great. Well, maybe in our last minute, Wayne, because this dovetails nicely from what you were just talking about, what are some tips and tricks for aligning product and engineering on these architectural improvements or architectural modernization initiatives?
It's a great question. I'll try and keep this one succinct, which is, I'll give an example. A lot of organizations that have moved to the dev, I'll give you one example. An organization has moved to DevSecOps, and the product team is following Scrum and Kanban, and they've got the various roles within those product teams. It's a two pizza-sized team, and they've got various roles. So that they'll have the product manager, and the product manager will be working with the business, and then there'll be architectural alignment. The way that I see it is best working in terms of that alignment is where there is also the clarity of the role of things like the release train engineer or the release train manager. So somebody that is thinking strategically, not only within cross-functional product groups within the team, but also thinking of those interdependencies from a modernization perspective across the team. So for example, a release train manager or release train engineer that is sitting across multiple program incremental planning meetings every 12 weeks as part of the PI planning. So I think it's about communication and clarity, but also around really defining what the accountability from a responsibility, accountability, contributing and informed perspective is across those teams. So it's more around the structure of a modern DevSecOps team, that if you get it right, is that closer alignment in terms of the decision making between engineering and architecture specifically, and then appeasing the business need, actually becomes a lot more fluid, and just runs a lot more smoothly based on how those roles interact in the team.
Makes sense. Thanks, Wayne. Well, we are 1 minute past our scheduled time, so I wanted to thank everybody for your time today. Hope this is a great kickoff to your week and that you have a great week in front of you. As I mentioned, the recording will be available, and the slides also, we will send a link to that. They're also downloadable for the next little bit in the handouts window. So thank you again for your time. Thanks, Wayne, our speaker today, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.
Thank you, James. Thank you for your time, everyone.